Hello, I'm Dan Alasso, and I want to continue my exploration of some of these economic ideas that go along with capitalism. In part two of this series, I made a little short list of reasons that people might be less enthusiastic about the term capitalism, even if it technically means nothing more than that accumulated wealth is being reinvested into productive activities. The first of these possible issues, I said, was the tendency of wealth concentration. And wealth concentration, when you think about it, is an empirical measure or an observation that can be tested with data. The question would be, on the average, does a wealthy person tend to acquire more wealth, or is there some type of reversion to the mean that might level wealth over time? In this form, it's just a measurement, and the more important questions, I think, are how and why might wealth accumulate or not accumulate? What forces could cause large fortunes to revert to an average? And even more importantly, what tools might people be using to prevent that from happening? Now, it's not at all clear to me whether, in the absence of any confounding factors, wealth would tend to accumulate or to dissipate. And really, I'm not going to devote any of my energy to trying to determine this, because I don't think I can think of a single instance in which there were no confounding factors. In every case that I can imagine, individuals or groups of people are trying to influence wealth, either to concentrate and protect it, or to diminish or redistribute it. Now, wealth is not the only determinant of power, but it is a very important one. There are other ways that people can achieve power, but wealth works to accelerate and to enhance most of them. Where power comes from having more knowledge, it's easier to get a good education if you're wealthy. Where power comes from access to political insiders, it's easier to buy your way in if you have a lot of cash to spread around. Where power comes from superior physical force, such as military, it's easier to acquire that if you're rich. And finally, where power comes from business success, it's easier to be successful if you're starting on third base. In capitalism, wealth is deployed to produce more goods and services that have economic value. Wealth could also be spent or invested in other things, such as art or charity or consumption, in ways that wouldn't produce economic value. But let's focus on the investments designed to create more stuff for the economy. If entrepreneurs have an idea for a business, they need to either control wealth themselves, that they can invest into it, or they need to talk somebody who has wealth into investing it. There are a lot of ways that this can be done, with different consequences for who will ultimately benefit from the resulting business if it's successful. Generally, societies that provide more opportunities for people with good ideas to find patrons are thought of as having a better chance for progress, while those where wealth is simply hoarded or is used for ostentation are seen as stagnant. Now, of course, this assessment depends on several assumptions about progress that I'm going to pass by here, but we'll probably return to in the future. We tend to think of free markets as ones where the government avoids interfering as much as possible. Beyond merely guaranteeing that the economy can operate without theft or force or fraud. Does it make sense to maybe consider access to capital as a measure of freedom too? As I've mentioned before, property laws are constructed by society. So a community that decides that a person or a family or a corporation that acquires a resource has an absolute property right over it indefinitely may be setting up barriers to opportunities for people who didn't happen to arrive first. If all the land is spoken for, then a new farmer with a great new innovation that might be very profitable for everybody might find herself unable to show the value of that new idea. Major technological revolutions tend to level the playing field for a bit, once again allowing people who get there first to benefit. But once again, the field becomes crowded, and early winners tend to become hard to catch. I mentioned previously that the historian Michael Merrill had claimed that Adam Smith was an anti-capitalist. A big element of Smith's objection, I think, had to do with this concentration effect. Smith warned against concentrations of economic power, particularly through monopolies and cartels. He argued that wealthy merchants and manufacturers often colluded to manipulate markets, to raise prices, and to stifle competition, which would harm the public. For example, he wrote in The Wealth of Nations that people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public, or in some contrivance to raise prices. That's from Book 1, Chapter 10. It's interesting, though, that this criticism could apply as easily to labor unions and guilds as to manufacturers' cartels. Smith also criticized mercantilist policies that favored wealthy elites, such as protective tariffs, and guilds that restricted economic freedom. Productive assets like factories and equipment tend to change with technologies and with products, so they may not provide permanent moats against competitors. But once people or corporations get permanent ownership of land or of primary natural resources, it can become nearly impossible for anyone to compete with them until a new technology once again disrupts the markets. Historically, the easiest way for a Latin American country to trigger a US-sponsored coup has always been to suggest land reform or to nationalize extractive industries. We can only hope that ongoing innovations will continue to reset the playing field from time to time. Wealth is not static, and it can be created, which does offer some new opportunities to people who haven't already accumulated their own. And in any case, there's probably more money around out there than good ideas. So hopefully, people who come up with innovations will be able to get access to capital on terms that aren't too onerous to be worthwhile. So those are just a couple of thoughts I had on concentrations of wealth. I'll return to some of those other objections that I mentioned in that list soon, but I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.